Rock and roll, brother.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers Atlanta Metro Chapter monthly meeting. Before we get started with the presentation, I have a few announcements to make. GSP will be exhibiting at the Build Expo on July 15th and 16th at the Cobb Galleria Center. GSP will have tickets to distribute. Please let us know if you're interested. If you have a job opening, please send us the details and we'll be glad to announce it at our next meeting. You can also visit the state website at gspe.org and post it there. As you well know, volunteers are key to the success of every organization. We're looking for volunteers in the following areas. We're looking for volunteers to join the board of directors. The term of the current board comes to an end in December, so this would be for the 2021 calendar year. We're also looking for volunteers for our Math Counts competition. Math Counts is our premier event of the year. It is a nationwide middle school mathematics competition that starts out at the local level and then progresses to the state and national levels. And there we would be looking for volunteers to coordinate. We will also be looking for volunteers to help us find sponsors. The Georgia Engineering Academy, it's a week-long camp for middle school age kids. GSPE, along with other organizations, have joined together through the Georgia Engineering Foundation to implement a common scholarship program and promote STEM for the benefit of students from Georgia. For additional information, you can visit gefinc.org. Wanted to make you aware of all the different ways in which you can stay in touch and share professional engineering and GSPE news. We have a LinkedIn group, GSPE. It is open to PEs, EITs, working engineers, aspiring engineers, educators, and engineering students of all disciplines. We also have a YouTube channel. The name of the channel is GSPE. We currently have over 130 subscribers. We're also on Meetup. The name of our Meetup group is, you guessed it, GSPE. We have almost 400 members at this point. And once you join these groups, I encourage you to please invite colleagues to join as well. Finally, if you're not already a member of NSPE, I encourage you to join. NSPE represents licensed professional engineers in the US. It is the recognized voice and advocate of licensed professional engineers in 53 states and territorial societies and well over 500 local chapters. Today's presentation title is Rippling Supply Chain Disruptions. Our presenters today are Greg White and Tom Valentine. Greg is principal and host of Supply Chain Now, an internet broadcasting site spotlighting the best of all supply chain, things supply chain, the people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. Greg's also a partner with Trefoil Advisory. He's a serial founder, CEO, board director, and advisor in B2B technologies with multiple successful exits. He's an insightful visionary who helps companies rapidly align vision, team, market, messaging, product, and intellectual property to accelerate value creation. Greg guides founders, investors, and leadership teams to create breakthroughs and gain market exposure and momentum to increase company esteem and valuation. Tom Valentine is president of Valentine Solutions, a professional sales representative company working with best-in-class solution providers to help domestic or global supply chain, freight management, and distribution warehousing challenges. He has been in the logistics field since 2001. Tom was recently asked to be on the board of advisors for the new Georgia Logistics Association. He is a recipient of the President's Award from the PPC, Petroleum Packaging Council, and asked to participate in the 2018 Gold Circle Leaders in Entrepreneurship at Kennesaw State University. He is a former co-chair of the Atlanta Warehousing Educational Research Council, WORK, and he remains on the advisory board today. He's active in numerous trade associations, but both locally in Atlanta as well as nationwide. He has appeared on podcasts, webinars, live speaking engagements, the Shrimp Tank, as well as the infamous Supply Chain Now radio. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Greg and Tom.
Good evening, everybody. Let me just tweak the sizing a little bit here. One got much bigger than the other. But wanted to welcome everybody to tonight's presentation on behalf of the Atlanta Metro Chapter of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers. And to let you know that tonight our presenters have asked that you hold your questions to two different slides. They'll let you know when they're ready for questions. Let's see. It's not going to stay that way for long. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Greg and Tom. I'll futz with it on my end, but we won't delay the presentation anymore. Take it away, guys.
Hey, what would it be if we didn't have some sort of technical difficulty on these presentations? I've got to tell you, I've done a lot of these in the last few weeks. And this one has gone off very smoothly and well prepared. So thanks Steve, Jesus, and Roger for putting this together for us. I'm Greg White with Supply Chain Now. I do this for a living. These sort of speaking engagements, and of course, some of the podcasts that Tom referred to that he's been on are ones that I've done. I started in supply chain on the practitioner side in retail and did that for, Tom and I have agreed to never confess to more than 2 decades. So we've been in supply chain for around 2 decades, we'll call it that. And worked for Kmart, you might remember them, or you might not. O'Reilly Automotive, and a precursor company that was there. And then I moved into technology, and I've done approximately 500 or so technology implementations on the supply chain planning and forecasting, warehouse management, and optimization side. So I come from that side of the practice, and that's why I'm here talking to you. I'll let Tom tell you a little bit more other than his impressive history, about the perspective that he'll take today in this presentation as well.
Thanks, Greg. Definitely shout out. It's an honor to be here with you all this evening. Special shout out and thank you to Roger, Jesus, and Steve for inviting us to speak here this evening on our favorite subject, which is supply chain. A lot going on, as you all can imagine. We're going to make it a little bit more relevant to how that impacts you as engineers here this evening. To Greg's point, one of my prior seasons, I only had a couple in my life. I've been in the logistics space in 2001, quote unquote officially. But prior to that, in the 80s and 90s, my background took me into the semiconductor distribution sales aspect of the business, and worked for the fourth largest in North America, Marshall Industries, which was absorbed by Avnet in 1999. So candidly, it kind of brings me back tonight. Kind of brings me back to my roots. I worked a lot of design and electrical engineers. I personally do not claim to be an engineer remotely even try to fix plumbing or anything within my house. So my admiration goes out to each and every one of you on the call this evening. But I do understand some of the challenges in the design aspect of the business, given my background in that world. So with that, we're going to move forward here with our presentation. We have a couple spots where we're going to look for your feedback and input. And with that, if we get that up on the screen, we'll move that forward.
Hey, one quick, while that changes, one quick point. I think that it's, as Tom and I were preparing for this, we realized that supply chain is not dissimilar to engineering in this regard, and that is that it's largely misunderstood or not completely understood. And as we were talking about it, I reverted to an old saying that somebody told me once long ago, an engineer in the family, I'm sure. An optimist, a glass is half full. A pessimist says a glass is half empty, but an engineer knows you have twice as much glass as you need. So we think a lot along the same lines, is think about things differently about how to make them efficient. And that's a common thread through supply chain. It's a very engineering centric discipline. We're not nearly as well educated, but.
Well,
did we get the agenda up? Sorry, I'm not viewing that.
Yeah, give me just a second though, guys.
Okay.
I am seeing once again for some reason the
so fire away in the chat if you have them already. We'll accumulate those and make sure we address them along the way.
all right, and the presentation's reloading again, but it looks like I should have it squared away. Let it just load up here. Come on.
We're doing the break fix engineering right here on
Yeah,
site. Right
exactly. Now. It's amazing how you set it all up and in the dry run, and then it all changes on you.
He's not kidding. It worked just fine in the dry run.
All right, gentlemen, we are good to go. They should see
live.
it just fine. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
We're getting there.
Yep. You take it away.
Are you seeing that, Greg?
Yeah, I'm seeing the agenda slide.
Okay. I'm still seeing you, but we're going to move forward here and we'll make it work. How's that?
Yeah, everybody should be seeing it exactly right now, guys.
Okay.
Okay.
So what are we going to cover tonight on several of our topics? I know it was published in some of the press release, but real quick on our agenda tonight, we have some key topics that we're going to cover. Pre-COVID-19, what is a supply chain? I know that sounds really basic, but you'd be surprised how supply chain has come to the forefront as you turn to any pretty much news rag, whether social media or on your TV or cable or internet feed. Supply chains everywhere right now. how the supply chain was disrupted. We're going to talk about the impact of orders, freight, and transportation, and how you are an important part of each one of those categories. We're going to talk about and bring up some common questions and or misconceptions in regards to supply chain, as well as the supply chain of what we believe is the future and what is that going to look like coming post-COVID-19. So with that, I'm going to hand off here to Greg. And Greg, if you could tell us where were we and where are we headed?
Yeah. So I think an important part of this conversation is to understand where we were in terms of commerce and supply chain and really the world. And it's not as if anyone forgets that, but we just wanted to give a little bit of perspective here to give you an idea. We were at full employment, for instance, and there were 2 million unfulfilled trade jobs. If anyone is a Mike Rowe fan, you're probably familiar with his efforts to try and fill trade and professional jobs out there. The Dow was at a record high on February 19th. The Dow hit a record high. In the fourth quarter of 2019, we had added $186 billion to the GDP. And then at its worst, though we are definitely coming back, but at its worst, during this great seismic societal disruption and pandemic, the Dow hit as low as 18,000. Unemployment is not in government terms, which undercounts, but in total terms around 24%. And the GDP gains in Q4 were 100% plus erased. So clearly things changed, and they changed because in virtually overnight, we sent people home without too much notice, and that obviously had a big impact on commerce, and we're still seeing it. Frankly, Q2 will be worse than Q1, and some of this is general news, but some of this is just for perspective on what has changed, and clearly that had a big impact on the supply chain, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So before we do that, let's talk about what a supply chain is. So go ahead, Tom. Did you have a question? Tom, I'll take your questions now.
You take my question? All right, great. Well, I just thought it was important to point out, we're starting to get the economy moving again, right? We're in a great state of Georgia, and we took a lot of grief, right, for opening up early, which was, prior to a week or two before other states started opening up. So we were kind of first at it. But I just took a snapshot today, and you know what? I saw that, the Dow Jones was actually up to 27.5 today, right, or an increase of 461 points, which equates to 1.7% increase for today. So that's a big jump from where we were just a little over a month ago, when it was just at about 18.5. So as we move through this, we always have hope. Keep pressing forward. And once more people get back to work, we're going to see continued growth and continued positive outcomes here.
Yeah, no doubt. And look, supply chain is about resilience. Frankly, disruption is common and constant in supply chain. And so as a profession, supply chain professionals are equipped to deal with disruption. This was an exceptional disruption, which is why it had such a dramatic impact. But to go back to our previous point, which was supply chain is a little bit like engineering. I hesitate to say that. I don't want to overstate that, because you all have degrees in engineering. Tom and I do not have degrees in supply chain. And even the degrees that you get now, you can get an undergrad degree in supply chain, but you couldn't when we were in school. So we've learned through the school of hard knocks. But it is a very complex and constantly moving profession. So and a lot of the other business people, like engineering and sometimes accounting, they see what we do as this sort of dark magic where they just want what they want. Make it so. You geeks go off in the corner and do something to make it happen. So it's a very similar conundrum for people in the profession. But let's talk a little bit about what a supply chain is, and it's important to remember, and we're going to reiterate this a couple of times. It's important to remember that the supply chain begins and ends with the consumer. There's no reason for a supply chain if someone can provide everything that they need for themselves. So the origination of supply chain was somebody wanting that stone to make an arrowhead for their spear when they were a caveman, or that vegetable, or whatever to feed themselves when they were a caveman. So think of supply chain from that standpoint. And if you think about it, it's a series and a progression of products. So let's think about it from a farm or raw materials standpoint. Somebody grows wheat. I'm from Kansas, so naturally I go to wheat. Somebody grows wheat, and then it's ground into flour, and then it's produced into bread. Then it's packaged and shipped off to a distributor who distributes it to grocery stores and restaurants. And then a consumer goes to whatever that retail market is, whether that retail market is online, in person, or delivery. In the old days, you didn't have to go online to have delivery. If you ever lived in Chicago, you know that Jewel was doing grocery delivery in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s. So some of these things are not new concepts, but the volume with which they are conducted today is much, much greater. And over, kind of underpinning or overarching all of this is transportation. So what keeps the goods on the shelves is what keeps the goods moving. And that's really, Tom, I'll let you talk
Sure.
a little bit about that, because that's really your expertise.
Thanks, Greg. So transportation, and you can see it runs from end to end in this, simple supply chain drawing. And, a lot of times we have a tendency to overcomplicate processes. And, Greg and I, when we got together and was putting this together for you all, we wanted to keep it kind of simple. I think if you go to, I was brought up in the KISS genre, and if you don't know what that means for the younger generation, please look it up. It is something to live by, because we all have a tendency inherent to try to overcomplicate things. So hence, this is the graphic that we utilized to kind of display, what is a supply chain and how does that product flow, right? And transportation truly runs from end to end, because when you're at the farm or the raw material, you got to transport it somehow to the manufacturing facility. You got to transport it from manufacturing to packaging, because there's always some type of transport, whether that's internal and truly internal by moving products through your own manufacturing facility.
Right.
Depending on the size and scope. I mean, there's companies that take up acres and acres of land, right? And those materials have to move internally. And there's also the opportunity, once the product's produced and ready to go, finished goods, there's various ways to get that transported. That all-encompassing terminology basically is summed up in logistics. And I'll never forget, I was with a professor on shrimp tank and was asked the question, Tom, how do you define logistics? And like I said, I'm not the degree guy, I'm not the engineer, but I just simply answered him. I said, logistics is really just moving stuff from point A to point B. And in its pure essence, it's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's in its most simplified form. The actual definition of logistics is the commercial activity of transporting goods to consumers. And that's exactly what we're displaying here today. Now, how does that all happen? It is actually becomes very complex, because you have to have a harmonization and synchronization of timing to make everything work so that you can get your Amazon package on your doorstep that you just ordered either earlier this morning or it arrives the next day. So there are a lot of complexities that come into play to make all that happen. Through this supply chain, I know we have shipping and distribution and a couple pictures of a little trucks of a big 53-footer and maybe a little Sprinter van. But when you really open it up and you look inside, how do we actually transport goods in the supply chain today? That could be ocean, it could be air, it could be truck, and that could be full truckload. It could be long haul, going coast to coast, near shore, in and out of Mexico, Canada. Barges, a lot of people forget about. There's a lot of freight that moves on barges through our river systems. Flatbeds, LTL, which stands for less than truckload. Parcel, and then a new term that's kind of come to the forefront within the past, I'd say 5 years, and that's been driven typically by the Amazon effect, which is the final mile, which is getting goods from the distribution center or the micro warehouse location to you, the consumer. And that ends up being the final mile. And that's become more and more important as we move forward from a B to B concept to more of a B to C concept in servicing you as consumers directly, right from either a manufacturing location or distributing or e-commerce. So
yeah, those are the cute gray vans you're seeing all over the place.
Yep.
It's also UPS and FedEx trucks, really, any parcel deliverer, right? And sometimes even someone in a car. I've actually had that happen. A 1996 Lexus LS 400 delivery vehicle, and all sorts of vehicles, drones. We're constantly thinking about how to do this more effectively to eliminate things like congestion and that sort of thing, and to reach rural areas as well. So there's a lot to think about. One theme you will hear repeated constantly here is complexity. Another theme you'll hear repeated will be risk or risk management.
Right. And, through COVID, with COVID-19 hitting, really it brought our entire economy to a dead stop. And it was kind of like the old Chicken Little, right? The sky's falling, the sky's falling. The supply chain's broke. What do we do? What do we do? A lot of people weren't even aware about, of supply chain and what that truly meant. And now through the transport of goods, everybody's feeling that impact, right? But really, there's always hope. We are Americans. We simply just need to all get back to work, which we are all doing. It maybe look different, right? But we're all getting back to work. We're looking for to make it better through continuous improvement, better visibility, better communication, and to Greg's point, through improvement of technology and advancement of technology in the supply chain. And we're going to touch on that as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how we got disrupted. So yes, the pandemic had a big effect on it, and yes, as Tom has said and I said earlier, this and Brad Jacobs, the CEO of XPO Logistics, coined this phrase, this seismic societal disruption, where we virtually ceased commerce and business and did it virtually overnight. That had a big impact on it. And then getting people back to work and that sort of thing had an impact on it. But look, you can probably relate. Hopefully you're seeing a grocery cart full of toilet paper on your screen, and hopefully you're not seeing it anywhere else, like in your local grocery, but I'm sure that you did, or someone you know and love did at some point. Because one of the things that's critical to understand is that the supply chain and retailers and distributors and manufacturers, they build their supply chain regardless of what we've talked about in terms of lean and just-in-time inventory, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But regardless of that, they build their inventory or their supply chain to be able to respond to upticks in demand, to disruptions in supply, to unexpected occurrences in local and global areas. So it took a tremendous uplift in demand. In fact, the uplift in demand for paper products was 753% overnight. It went from on March 12th, its roughly normal range around 40%, to a 753% on March 13th. And that think about tolerances and variances and things like that in engineering. Any kind of change like that is going to cause flex at least and breakage at worst. So that was a big impact. Plus, people were not, and that includes people who worked in the supply chain. People were not at work. So that created delay. There are some other additional factors that we're going to talk about. One is, and you may or may not know this, in the States and virtually only in the United States, inventories are managed manually in grocery stores. In virtually every other country in the world, they're managed with automation. We'll talk a little bit about that in the supply chain of the future. But the pandemic itself shifted demand patterns. The panic and herd mentality that, oh my gosh, somebody's buying all the toilet paper, I better get mine before it's all gone, kind of thing, and the bullwhip effect. So the effect that occurs, whatever occurs in the store, has a rippling effect that occurs throughout the supply chain. Hence the title of this presentation, right? Because it does ripple and it does create a larger and larger effect up the supply chain. Because when the store runs out and someone panics to buy or doesn't panic to buy in the store or for the store, then that has an impact upstream that the supply chain was not prepared for. So these kind of things can impact for a long time. Tom and I both have had countless discussions and given countless interviews to media and whomever else about what and why and how to avoid this. And the fact is, this is the greatest disruption the supply chain has ever seen.
Yeah.
In my opinion, we'll probably ever see. We will never instantaneously cease commerce overnight. Again, hopefully we won't be that stupid. So it had an impact on supply chain that is never seen, and yet, while bent and maybe even slightly damaged, the supply chain did not break. And again, in some cases, that was because of the consumer getting involved. If you live in Atlanta, you saw some of the situations where distributors were distributing directly to consumers. Buckhead Meats made their unbelievably delicious steaks available direct to consumers because restaurants were closed and people couldn't go get them. I bought a 50-pound bag of rice from my favorite Mexican restaurant. So, you got to remember that you as a consumer are an active participant in the supply chain. And frankly, we in supply chain need to think more about that as well. So that's been a learning, by the way, that we've had. Tom, anything you want to add there?
Well, yeah, I guess first of all, I just was really kind of looking at your slide and velvet. We're kind of a Charmin family, so I don't know. I may have to go out and try to see if we can find velvet because that just sounds pretty comfortable. Just saying.
Yeah.
But,
well, I was trying to find a big old Kirkland part.
But Greg hit that. It hits the nail on the head, and a lot of the products, just real life examples, and I'm sure each one of you have them as well. My wife and I went to Sam's Club, right? And this was kind of just when COVID was starting to hit, and we've shopped there for years, right? But I have a tendency sometimes to think a little bit differently. So I was perplexed when I looked down the aisle and all the paper products were gone, right? Your toilet paper, your paper towels, all the Clorox products, et cetera. But, when I walked over to the food supply area, they had those, less than a penny napkins that you get mostly at restaurants. They were stacked full to the ceiling in pallets. So I was a little perplexed. So we just bought that, right? For $6-7 for, I think, 5,000 pieces of little paper. The other thing that I was perplexed about was everybody was, buying all the meats, and we have reasons for that too. But again, going back to that panic and herd mentality and how that affected the supply chain, they were taking things off the shelf. There was no chicken to be had. That was the other thing. You go to the freezer sections, there's no chicken to be had. But as I walked over to the pharmacy type area, right, there's shelves and shelves of protein bars, which are like 30 grams per. It's like a meal in a Snickers bar. And I was perplexed. Why aren't people buying these? Because these are going to last. They have a much longer shelf life than chicken and other goods. And the other aisle had a ton of beef jerky in it, and I couldn't understand that. So I bought beef jerky and power bars, and we have them here today. So it's just a little bit different. And again, that panic and herd mentality, we see it not just in supply chain, we're seeing it in other, geopolitical environments. But no supply chain can withstand a 753% increase. And I just ask each one of you to think about your own company and your own business. How would you handle a 753% increase overnight? And with that, we're going to jump to the next slide here.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I don't think anyone in supply chain ever thought of that. I don't think that number would have come to mind of anyone's, right, Tom? No one would have said,
right,
if we have a 753% increase in demand, what are we going to do about that? Right. And so anyway, that's, that is what it is. But actually, the response to that disruption was pretty good, up to about 150 to 250% of demand. It was past that point when we started running out. And even so, the shelves were replenished relatively quickly. Herd mentality and panic buying continued. I can count myself among the guilty. We have 3 packs of Kirkland toilet paper in our house because, you may have experienced it. Every time you went to the store for that thing that you wanted, that you didn't find last time, you bought as much as you could get the next time, or as much as they would let you. So tell us a little bit about how that impacted upstream, right? Upstream being upstream of retail, upstream of the consumer into orders and freight and the transportation that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So, and Greg has already mentioned this, the COVID-19 actually created a forced change in consumer behavior. Some of that was restrictive because guess what? Overnight, the restaurants were closed, right? So you couldn't go to maybe your favorite restaurant and get food. But with regards to impact to orders, right? We have some data here. U.S. e-commerce sales, they were actually up. So e-commerce sales were actually up an average of 49% from April 1st through April 23rd, compared to the period of March 1st to 3/11. So we're always trying to find a positive in something that's negative. Consumer spending in the U.S., it tumbled to a record 16.4 in April. But again, e-commerce sales were up 49%. Yeah. Non-store sales, including online retailers, saw growth in their category of 8.4%. So yes, was there a significant disruption on impact to orders in the supply chain? Definitely. But there's actually some good news in the silver lining, and it's forced companies, again, going back to that forced change by consumer behavior. Look what's happening, right? Okay, so we have to wear some masks for a while. We have to wear some gloves in some instances. Everybody is adapting to kind of a new norm, right? And so is your favorite restaurant. My wife and I, we went out to eat at our favorite restaurant this past week and actually sat indoors. And notice social distancing. The tables are further spread apart, right? The server gave us a flip card. Do we want to have constant service or just temporary service? and you just flip that card, and it has some lean principles. It's green on one side if you want continuous service, and it's red on the other if you want intermediate service. Do you want flatware, real silverware, or do you want paper products? So all these things we never even thought about before. But guess what? Each one of those products, each one of those signs, those are impact to orders in the supply chain because somebody's producing them, somebody's printing them. The cardboard guys and the paper guys are creating the paper and pumping it out. We're using ink to print those. So those are all impacts to orders and what we've seen. So what we've also seen is a significant mode shift. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So I mentioned it earlier on in one of the beginning slides that we showed the simple supply chain, right? All those different variations of how we move goods from point A to point B. Due to COVID-19, we've had a significant shift in every one of those modes. So we had a ton of ocean containers coming into all of our ports. We're blessed to have Savannah, and we have some inland ports, whether you're aware of that or not, here in the state of Georgia as well. And the number of containers that's moving through the port is really astronomical. And if you ever have an opportunity to go visit that, I highly recommend it because it is logistics in motion. And they're a great group of individuals, be happy to show you.
And there are bars nearby, so
yeah,
it's entertaining as well.
Yep. But what we've seen happen was all of a sudden overnight, ocean containers stopped.
Yeah.
And every one of those containers has goods, probably some of yours, your goods that you may have engineered and designed with your company. So that a lot of that shifted to air, right? We had truckloads going East Coast, West Coast, long haul shipments, shifting more towards LTL, less than truckload, and especially because, again, the consumer behavior drove it, driving a significant increase to the parcel community with UPS, FedEx, even DHL and USPS, right? Just recently, as of last week, actually, if you connect with me on LinkedIn, you can see one of my posts. FedEx just followed UPS in regards to putting in surge pricing. Usually that's reserved for the holiday season when there's a huge impact in small package, but they actually put it, so you're actually paying more now through coming out of COVID-19 because they are so overwhelmed in their supply chain. Right. We've seen freight, right? Freight literally overnight stopped, returned. It was mitigated or stored. I had a couple of our companies that we represent specialize in freight management. And we literally had customers that in their supply chain, the product had left their supplier, their governor of that particular state, and I'll use a real life example, in Texas, actually shut down. Product was already in transport to our customer in Michigan as we're moving that freight via less than truckload. Michigan shuts down literally overnight. So you had all this freight the first 3 to 4 weeks of COVID-19 and everybody in the stay in place order. We were actually working behind the scenes to mitigate all this freight that was in movement and trying to find a home for it. It either had to be returned back to the supplier, which in a lot of cases we couldn't do that because that state closed. A lot of carriers, which were moving the freight, they were offering to store freight, but that's going to be an expensive avenue at the end of the day for you, the manufacturer, right, in getting your raw goods. So we actually were help mitigating and talking with our customers. This is where communication comes into play. This is where moving forward, the advancement in visibility and technology in the supply chain is going to solve some of these problems, because in today's time frame, a lot of people didn't know exactly where that freight was. So we were literally manually making phone calls, sending emails to mitigate the freight and get customers to open up or to send somebody into their dock for a small window of opportunity to deliver that product and receive it, so that when they reopened, that product was already there, and they weren't storing or facing storage charges. I had one customer of mine that said, you know what, we're officially closed. We're not taking any more product. It's law. We're not sending anybody in. Force majeure. Force majeure is a contractual term, which means greater force. It basically removes liability for catastrophes that's interrupted unexpectedly through natural or God acts of God. What I had to break that news to my customer was, you're a little bit late because all the carriers already declared force majeure. So you're going to get stuck with a really big storage bill at the end of the day. So a lot of that mitigation was happening through COVID-19 and still does today, actually. Another thing that was impacted that we saw was our drivers, right? Out there on the road. All of a sudden, you got the national parks, you got the rest areas, you got every government organization pretty much shutting down. Mm-hmm. Well, we're trying to transport goods, right, throughout the U.S. They're on the roads. They have to adhere to service hours, so they have to shut down, but they had no place to go to the restroom. They had no place to sleep. So if you were out at all on the roads for whatever reason, especially early morning or evening, you would just see literally almost a mile or two of semis stacked on interchanges sleeping because they had nowhere else to go. So,
and another difficulty they had was, the regulations could literally vary county by county or yes, municipality by municipality. They could be required to be wearing a mask in the cab on one side of a county line and not on another. So it was a very difficult scenario for product in motion.
Right. So those are a lot of the impacts that we've seen, to the orders, freight, and transportation. And the drivers are still, when they show up at your door, and if you happen to be on a break or walk outside, you know what, give them a high five virtually and thank those drivers because they're dealing with a lot. A lot of them have to get their temperatures taken now. There's a lot of HIPAA and privacy that comes into play. There's a lot of things that they're dealing with. And just remember, they're bringing your design and your goods that you designed to you, your manufacturing or bought to you. So let's treat them right. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. And transportation in motion, I don't think was a lot of what people thought about. They thought, okay, commerce stopped, but there were literally trillions of dollars worth of goods on the oceans, on trains, on trucks, in the air, where with no place to go, left on the docks in Shenzhen or wherever, right? And continuing to stack up, because one thing we've got to think about also is that China restarted production before shipping restarted and before receiving restarted in the ports in the States. So it was a difficult and again complex and risky scenario.
Yeah. By the way, Greg, yeah. thanks for covering me on the rail. My buddies at CSX and UP and Norfolk would probably be upset because I didn't include rail in that logistics.
You said ground transportation, so I was giving you a pass.
Thank you. So
yeah, go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just going to say, moving on here to some common questions and, misconceptions. Greg did a great job in putting this together. And Greg, if you want to grab the ball here, please do.
Yeah, sure. So, we have had a lot of these discussions. So we literally publish a podcast or a live stream or a vlog on supply chain every single day of the week, except Sunday. And so we've had this discussion a lot in the last 12 weeks. And think about, I am just beginning to put it in perspective that it has been 10-ish, 12 weeks that this has been going on. So it feels a little bit like a time warp to me, and it may to some of the rest of you as well. But these are common questions or common misconceptions that we've gotten. And you may or may not be familiar with lean or just-in-time inventory. Tom can give you a little more detail, but essentially the principle is to do business with the absolute bare minimum of inventory. Now, that typically occurs at the manufacturing level. A lot of the stories that you may have heard where they were talking about lean, they were talking as if the entire supply chain was lean, as if the retailers and the distributors were running lean as well. But in fact, distributors and retailers have very complex calculations that help them assess what their safety inventory, their safe back stock ought to be in case of a disruption in the supply chain. Again, there are provisions in the supply chain for this, just not for an uptick this dramatic. So,
Yeah.
go ahead, Tom.
And Greg, I think at this time we were actually going to reach back out to Steve to see if you all had any questions. This was kind of our question stimulation slide, and wanted to see if we could take a couple questions midterm here, and provide some answers for you.
Sure. So so send those questions in, and Steve, do you want to just launch them at us as they come in?
Yes. And one thing, guys, if you do have questions for our presenters tonight, please include at GSPE in your question. That'll help highlight it for me so I don't accidentally miss it for you. And actually, it's kind of funny you guys brought up lean and just in time, because that is one of the things that didn't show up quite right. But Jesus was actually asking, what do you think the impact of this pandemic will be on lean and just-in-time initiatives going forward?
You want to start, Tom?
Sure, I'll start. Thanks for the question, Jesus. Given your background, it doesn't surprise me that question came from you. So with that being said, lean and JIT is really taking a beating through this COVID environment. And, candidly speaking, I think it's kind of a load of crap. Lean is a process, and lean has been developed to cut waste out of the processes. JIT is a process that's there to feed your manufacturing with limited inventory and on-hand inventory, and pipelining that through, again, the complexity of the supply chain. So there's been a lot of different schools of thought. We've read a lot of articles and heard a lot of people out there talking that lean's going away, the JIT is not the answer. But if you really go back to a lean principle and maybe use the 5 whys and dive down to a root cause, I think that you'll find, JIT actually expanded over the course of time. JIT was, founded by comes from really the Toyota environment, right? And Toyota actually, the principle of JIT was to have your supply chain close to you and have your raw materials so that your suppliers could actually hold the inventory and bring it in just in time for manufacturing to feed the line. My background, I was brought up in the world of Dr. Edward Deming, total quality management. So I get this, right? But Toyota, again, their furthest supplier typically when they were implementing true JIT was maybe a couple hours away, right? And you can go to right outside of Columbus, Ohio, where Honda's at, and you'll see there's a whole cottage industry of suppliers. You can go right here to the state of Georgia, down to
Warner
Kia,
Robins,
at Warner Robins, and down in the area, and you'll see a whole cottage industry of businesses that weren't there prior to Kia showing up.
Right.
So what's happened with JIT and that process is we've taken, because of trade imbalances and geopolitical environment and strictly the cost, found it cheaper to go offshore and sacrifice time, right? Because unless you're paying air, which most people try to refrain from doing to get it back over here, you're on a boat. And when it's on a boat and the ship coming over, you're looking at, 45, 60, 90 days, depending on the product, as well as the product's lead time that needs to be factored into that. So JIT kind of morphed itself due to external factors. And I think it's taken a beating because a lot of companies have China as, the primary source. And with China shutting down and taking care of China first, it's really impacted us here in North America. And I think you're going to see a lot of assessment, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute, in regards to how the supply chain is working today, how your supply chain is working today, and how can we make it better. But I will poo-poo, following the toilet paper analogy, where people are pointing fingers and blaming lean and JIT. Those are processes.
Well, I think we have to analyze this very objectively, and we have to analyze it using statistics. And as someone whose job it is to evaluate demand, the frequency of demand, the predictability of demand, and the likelihood of recurrence of demand, I can safely say, and have safely said over 100 times, we didn't have a supply problem. We had a demand problem. The demand problem was demand shifted by enormous percentages overnight on products that were already high volume. And the truth is, what we, the consumers did, was we consumed goods that we felt like we would need for the next 60 to 90 days all at once. And the supply chain is not built to do that. And why is it not built to do that? Because the cost of carrying enough inventory just in case, instead of just in time, just in case the entire world might increase demand by 753% would be crushing to any company. They could not possibly afford it. So the reality of the situation is that we had a demand explosion rather than a lean or a supply implosion. And I will argue, we will again likely never see that again in our lifetime, because we've now seen the impact of it, and we will provision to, if we go back into lockdown in the fall, which may very well happen, if we do that, we will plan a lot better. Both governments will plan better, supply chains will plan better, and consumers will plan better, because we will work hard, I hope at least governments do, to give greater notice that such a thing is about to occur. And some of these questions, why were the outages recurring? So I did an article with one reporter and and said that I expected supply chain to be back to normal in 6 to 12 weeks. Well, 8 weeks later, he said, hey, we're still having these running outages. And I said, hey, what was occurring that caused the outages to begin, the stockouts to begin with, is still occurring. People are still going, as I said earlier, they're still going to the store, and they're still hoarding whatever they can get because they're afraid it won't be there next time, or it wasn't there last time that they went. We've even had some very unfortunate circumstances where some very prominent people said the supply chain was broken to manipulate cost, to manipulate marketplaces, and that impacted the supply chain. When John Tyson, no shame in calling him out, he literally took out a full-page ad to do it. When John Tyson said the supply chain is broken, it has been argued, not by me, but it has been argued that there was some underlying reasoning there to drive the price of chicken up, and also to make excuses for why his supply chain of his particular company was failing. And if you've been watching the news on some of these topics, you realize Tyson has had one of the largest illness rates in the food industry. So there was a lot of self-preservation in that. But when we say complex, when we talk about supply chain, these are the kind of complexities that are faced every day, not just being able or unable to predict the consumer or the customer, and not just being able or unable to time the orders just right or to make sure the ship gets here without hitting a storm, but governmental and human intervention and manipulation of the marketplace also has an impact. So there are a lot of things, and that's why, and we're going to talk about this, why some advanced technologies are becoming more and more prominent in supply chain. So did anybody else have a question?
Yes, indeed. So
I bet
Jesus
they
actually
do.
had a follow-up, which you kind of touched on already. Will we see a big push to nearshore as a result of this pandemic?
We will see a big push. Will we see a big action? I don't think so. It'll take, first of all, let's put that in some perspective. Depending on the product, I think critical goods like medicines, we definitely need to do everything we can to free ourselves from the most dangerous entity on the planet, China, and gain some control back for those critical products, medicines, anything to do with safety or security or defense. Any of those things, they need to come out of China. The caveat to that being, one, China has the largest workforce in the world, 805 million people, and that can't be replaced by an accumulation of all of the other workforces in the world, even including with their unemployment rates. So we have to figure something else out. And Tom talked about it, and we'll talk about it some more, but we have to be able to absorb the cost, because the average Chinese manufacturing worker works for between $10,000 and $13,000 a year. In fact, 3.7 million of them work for nothing because they are slaves. So it's impossible to replace that workforce in size and in cost.
Right.
We will see some nearshoring. We will see some reshoring. If you're familiar with pharmaceuticals used to largely be produced in Puerto Rico, and there were some government incentives that made that worthwhile for pharma companies to do that. When those evaporated, of course, the companies went overseas. So there is some capability to bring that back. When we talk about nearshoring, Mexico is a mess. They're really struggling with, obviously, lawlessness, but now also with COVID. So we have to manage that very closely. I've talked with the Consul General of Trade for Georgia from Mexico, and they're working to get that situation under control. But there are just a lot of things, and it is a 7 to 10 year process. It took 7 to 10 years to get there, and it will take 7 to 10 years to extract ourselves from it. What I see happening is some reshoring, some nearshoring. I see more likely technological innovations in robotics for those companies that do come back. It won't bring jobs necessarily, but it won't lose jobs. And remember, we were at full employment when this thing hit, and with plenty of trade jobs unfulfilled. And we have to remember, again, I'm talking complexity here, right? We have to remember that 10,000 baby boomers a day are leaving the workforce. And those were largely the generation that did the manual labor. The incoming generations prefer analytical and technical work. And again, to replace a huge workforce like that, we're going to have some robotics and automation. So it's my belief that we'll be able to do all those things without costing people jobs. We'll elevate the types of jobs that people do rather than taking those jobs away.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if I may add to that real quick, I agree with Greg, and from that perspective, you know, the first knee-jerk reaction is, okay, bring everything back, pull everything out of China. And you see some companies that are making moves, right?
Yep.
But what they're doing is they're actually assessing. This is going to take us right into our next slide, actually. But you know, they're really assessing their supply chain, and it really comes back to, again, that root cause of, you know, why did they move offshore to begin with? So, you know, do you want to pay $2,500 for an iPhone, or do you want to pay $950 for an iPhone?
Is there a third option, Tom?
Yeah. You know, until some of those trade imbalances and excise taxes and such are equaled out for a level playing field, you know, what we're seeing some companies that are moving out of China, but, you know, maybe going to Vietnam, maybe going to, you know, the Philippines. They're still not quote unquote near shore or reshore, but they're quick moves because they're out of China and still low cost labor. But to Greg's point, technology and automation, and bringing it back here on our land, there are some things that has to take place, and that's not an overnight fix.
Yeah.
So we see that happening, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, and it'll be sparse,
Yeah.
relatively sparse compared to the discussions we're having today. Steve, any other questions?
Yep. Jeff Lentz asks, don't grocery store incentive card programs and barcode scanners automate inventory control? Kroger and Ingalls, for sure. Can you clarify Greg's manual inventory comment?
Yeah. What they tell them is, yes, you bought X and cumulatively you bought Y. What they do is they inform a report that a department manager gets to make that decision. Grocery stores in the U.S. are very, very complex, unlike the rest of the world. They come from the days, well, and in these days they still do this. Kroger actually sells the shelf space to Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola or General Mills or Kellogg in certain sections, and either that organization handles it manually or the department manager handles it manually. And believe it or not, in many chains, in some of the European chains, Aldi and his brother Lidl, they do have automated inventory management, meaning store counts, store inventory tracking, and in some cases automated replenishment, but in most cases it is in fact manual. And stores like Kroger, I can't say that all Kroger stores are this way, but many of them, the one near me I know is this way. They don't even know what they have on hand, and if you don't know what you have on hand, you don't know how much you need to buy. So it is a largely manual process, and that is something, as long as we're talking about it, that is something I see changing dramatically. That recognition has to have hit them in the face. But there are fiscal incentives to the merchants, the merchandise managers at the corporate level who manage that. The more money they get from the vendors, the more pay bonuses they get. So we're talking about things like realigning incentives and compensation programs before some of that is going to change.
Okay, and then next up, let's see. This was William Magliocco. I may have mispronounced that, but the Kia supplier plants, this is really more of a comment, I guess, but you guys might want to address it. The Kia supplier plants are close enough to Montgomery, Alabama, so they also supply the Hyundai plants there. The same company, same
Right.
supplier cohort.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
Smart, really.
It is very smart. I mean, and I've been to both plants and had spoke with operations managers at both those facilities. Got to tour through my experience with work. Geodis, which is the third party company that's actually doing the sequencing of parts. If you haven't had the opportunity to go, especially as engineers, I'd highly encourage you. They do give tours. Well, probably right not now, but soon when they get back to it. It's really impressive from the standpoint of not just the supply chain side, but also through the actual manufacturing process. When they're literally dropping in bumpers for an SUV that is white in color, and the next one behind it is a sedan, and it has the sequenced correct bumper coming down out of the ceiling, dropping right in to be put on as well. And it's right behind the white SUV. So they're actually impressive. The simple answer there is it's a great observation. It's exactly what they did. Hyundai actually was a test manufacturing location in Alabama across the Georgia border for the South Korean family that actually owns all of Hyundai and Kia, right? And if I would suggest, if you have the opportunity, is to try to tour the Hyundai facility first. And then when you go to Kia, you will see all the improvements that they took and lessons learned from the Hyundai facility and implemented into Kia. But yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, and a quick commentary. There's a lot we can learn from South Korea in terms of production and manufacturing efficiency and effectiveness and supply chain, and also managing a pandemic. They did an excellent job in all regards there. So
okay, looks like we got one more too. This was from Adolfo Ponce de Leon. India will change that. I think on home security, I did not want to place it on China, but could not find another nation to supply.
Yeah, India has its own issues, but they have good intentions, and they just recently, just in the last week, announced their intention to vie for production of cell phones, for instance. They're the second largest manufacturer of mobile devices in the world, and they do have a workforce that could do it. A lot of the issues in India are around human rights issues and infrastructure. They have 4 times as many slaves in India that they have in China. So, and if you've ever been to India, you've probably experienced some of the infrastructure challenges they've got, but they are working fast, and they are working on both of those things very aggressively. They've cut slavery by over a half, and their infrastructure continues to change in revolutionary fashion year to year. I have a lot more confidence and comfort doing business with India than China. Agreed.
And I want to be sensitive. I know we're running a little bit over on time, so we appreciate everybody staying with us. If we could go ahead and move on here. So we've only got
we'll take that next question at the end. Yep.
Yeah. So we have a couple more things to address and share with you all, and then we can see what other questions you have at the end we can address as well. So with that being said, what comes up, and this has already been prior conversation that we've addressed somewhat already, but the parallels with the reshoring and nearshoring, right? So what are we seeing companies doing? I wish I could take full credit for this slide, but I got to give a shout out to Lean Core, which ironically has the word lean in it. But one of the foremost thought leaders in supply chain itself, Robert Menachenko, who's the founder of Lean Core and comes from the Toyota environment out of Canada, actually. There's been a group of us and been blessed to be asked to be part of it. Have been working together through this COVID environment. There's probably about 30 of us supply chain professionals throughout the U.S. With the leadership from Lean Core to put it all together. This is just one component of a, you can see it says, well, that's slide 8 for us, but there's actually a whole combination of slides that we've put together to actually help companies assess their supply chain and understand their supply chain. Before I describe the slide, I want to reiterate how important you are you as engineers are to the entire supply chain. And you guys are brilliant at what you do, but always remember, keep your door open, or now keep your Zoom open to your other departments, right? And make sure that that communication is flowing upstream and downstream, because what your brilliance in designing and developing, if you happen to put in a single source item that happens to be halfway across the world, that could pose some issues into your supply chain. Maybe there's a better alternative to look at. How does that impact your supply chain? So as your design phases, pull those guys in from demand planning, pull them in from scheduling if you have them, pull them in from procurement, and in your C-level suite, and have those conversations. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a graphic representation. So if you start at the tip of the spear, right, if you're looking at it, it'd be your far left. Normal condition plan of 100%. The goal is OTIF, on time, in full. So is to fill those customer demands on time and in full. So as that tip of the spear begins to widen, you can see as in normal conditions, the risk is kind of mitigated. It's kind of, we have stability in the supply chain. But as changes in various conditions start to occur, you see that risk start to increase, and you see the stability start to decrease in your supply chain. And then, of course, we go to COVID-19, which would fall into the extreme change in a condition in the supply chain. And again, risk is off the charts. So the stability
doesn't exist.
It's either flexible or potentially broken, right?
Yeah.
So what's that bring us to? How flexible, asking questions such as, how flexible is your supply chain? And this comes back to some of the things we talked about earlier. Your visibility, your supply chain, what's happening in it, your capability. What is your capability if you had a 50% increase in your demand? How's that flex your supply chain? What about your resilience, right? How resilient is the supply chain? So as we follow that through the 4 core components there, with purpose, people, partners, which are your suppliers, right? And your distributors, and your own team members, actually. And then also the process and technology that's being implemented. And you can see, and I'm not going to go into it, but it sums it up there, from sources, which is your end-to-end supply chain operations. So you can see it flows from your supply chain all the way out to, again, who's driving the supply chain? The customer, your customers. So being engineers in a critical piece to, you are a critical piece to your success of your company's supply chain. Mm-hmm. Please take that to heart, and you have the power to do something. So don't be afraid to speak up within your organizations of what you're doing in your design phase, of how that can potentially impact your supply chain, not just downstream, but also upstream. And the other thing, and that I throw out there just to give you food for thought, right? In your supply chain, what needs fixed today? Are you guys asking those questions today of your own company through this COVID experience? How do we fix it? So we actually have come up with a formal assessment process that'll actually, the output will be official scorecard with a series of a deep dive questionnaire that we're going to help companies out with their supply chains and assess both the risk and the stability of your supply chains. So if there's a need there, please reach out to me or connect with me offline and through LinkedIn. Be happy to talk to you more about that. But this is critical. This is what we see a lot of companies doing. I was on a call earlier today with the CEO of a German company, which is based, their North American headquarters is based here in Georgia. And what he said when he was faced with that question, what are you doing about your supply chain? He said they are assessing every supplier, every component, and every widget that is used to make their final assembly product, to make sure that they adhere to specific requirements and that they can meet that risk and stability side of the equation. So they're taking it upon themselves to, assess each individual supplier in their supply chain. And in some cases, they've already made moves and eliminated that supplier and have gone with another one. So with that, Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah,
there,
just
Greg?
real quick. This is a lot about risk tolerance, right? That you can ride the razor's edge, roll the dice, if you will, but depending on how you want to manage your supply chain. And that's really what this allows you to assess, is what is the risk that you're willing to tolerate, and frankly, what is the cost that you're willing to pay to mitigate that risk. So this is a great it's a great diagram for assessing your supply chain. So let's talk a little bit about the future. We talked a little bit about this through some of the questions that we got. We talked, of course, we've heard a lot about new sourcing methodologies, reshoring and nearshoring. And again, this goes back to that risk question, right? How much risk do you want to take with a arguably unfriendly trade partner or trading country, versus the stability that you could potentially get, but at a cost. And there are lots of again, more things to consider here. And a lot of companies will be considering that, and they will be considering it long and hard. And again, it will be a long slog. I think we've confronted that pretty well. Now, a couple things to think about is USMCA is now fully ratified. We're not talking about that. Just not so long ago, we were talking about USMCA, the replacement of NAFTA, a better deal for everyone, frankly, for NAFTA, in replacement of NAFTA. So it's creating a better trade environment with Canada and Mexico in order to help there. So that may, in the near long term, help, right? Once Mexico gets to some stability, of course, Canada doesn't really have a large enough workforce to help too much in manufacturing, but once Mexico gets to some greater stability, and MCA could actually be a catalyst to that. And then, of course, we talked again about robotics. So these are the things that companies are thinking about. Supplier diversification, we touched on that a little bit. There's this whole theme of China +1, +2, +3. What I think will happen, and Tom and I have talked a lot about, is people won't necessarily reshore immediately or nearshore immediately. What they'll do is they'll move to Southeast Asia or India or even Africa or South America to have provisions, so that they don't have single source products, so they don't run that risk of those single sourced products and those single sources of even multiple products. And frankly, there are a lot of companies that were already doing that, but not enough. And again, when the whole world shuts down, there's really no second source to go to. But again, I'm a firm believer we won't have the entire world shut down all at once. Again, but even that is being provisioned for, but that is also very costly, so you have to manage for that. Let's talk a little bit about forecasting and planning and execution, because that is a very hot topic. Companies are, like grocery companies, they are actively seeking the ability to manage their inventory more effectively. There are companies who already have many retail restaurants have a better capability of managing their inventory than grocery store chains. Companies with traditional department or mass merchandise stores, Best Buy, Target, Walmart, all have the capacity to manage their inventories at a much better level than grocery. So all they're looking to do is improve on that. And the way that many of them are improving on that is to enable their e-commerce capability. Walmart's e-commerce sales were up 74% in the first few weeks of the lockdown, and likewise with Best Buy and Target and other e-commerce companies. So they are continuing to advance already relatively advanced technologies with things like the Internet of Things, basically being able to tell you all may, if you work in a manufacturing environment, you may work with this already, looking at tolerances and the movement of tolerances or the movement of efficiencies in devices to determine that they're wearing out. Things like that can give you a forward look at the need to replace it. Blockchain. Blockchain is essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it's an irrefutable record. It is, instead of a bill of lading on paper, it is a electronic communication that is unchangeable.
Chain of command.
So it formalizes and forever records that handoff. So for instance, stock doesn't get lost, right? Or it can be verified that a purchase order was received, or that it was fulfilled, or that a payment was made. All of those things can be done. Artificial intelligence, because the supply chain begins and ends with the consumer, which you're going to hear at least one more time in this presentation, because the supply chain begins and ends with the consumer, we have to change the paradigm of supply chain from predicting items. We're not predicting what toilet paper is going to do. We're not predicting the seasonality or the stability or the flexibility of toilet paper, because given its choice, toilet paper will sit on the shelf and wait. Look at the items in front of you and think about what they've done during this presentation. We are predicting consumers, but the lack of availability for literally centuries has forced us to use surrogates for evaluating demand. And instead of forecasting, what mostly we do in supply chain is postcasting. We look at what happened last year, or a running average, or whatever advanced forecasting methodology. It is simply an average with a trend or a seasonality component attached to it that looks at the past and says that some extrapolation of that represents the future. But you can see from COVID and from other things, shifts in demographics, that the past is absolutely no indication of the future. So AI allows us to evaluate what influences and makes a consumer act and predict the consumer, which is in aggregate a much more effective way of doing things. So those sorts of things. And then Tom touched on this a little bit earlier: visibility and analytics, alerts, right? Knowing where your product is, that it has stopped or that it has arrived or that sort of thing. And in real time, these things need to occur. So
Yeah.
Those are some of the things that are technologically driven, and some of them that are really process driven. What I think Georgia Pacific and Kimberly-Clark realized, they have too many SKUs of toilet paper. In order to get production to a maximum, instead of running 100,000 packages of this and then resetting and running 100,000 packages of that, they ran 200,000 packages of this. And I think they realized that consumers will, quote unquote, settle for less than optimal selection of toilet paper. So those are all things that will lead us into the supply chain in the future. Tom, you want to tackle some of that? And
Yeah, just real quick, and a couple comments along those lines. So in the CFO world, that your company's cash is king, right? Is usually the comment, right?
Right.
So cash flow and cash is king. Well, in the world where you're at, in designing products, right? The customer is the king. So it really comes down to, what does the customer want, and understanding what does the customer want. And again, a lot of that we understand doesn't maybe fall in the engineering realm, but it does fall within your organization, right? And understanding what it is that the customer is going to drive that demand for you to produce whatever SKU or whatever product it is that they're looking for. And some of them may not know what they're looking for, right? Because I mean, I came from the bleeding edge world where, you know, customers were designing new technology and new products, whether they were IoT. We represent companies that provide very, very in-depth BI tools, right? Business intelligence tools. We're given visibility to the transportation model through an audit process, right? And understanding the cost of transportation. You know, go back to Lean Core. You know, we do analysis for price, a price for every part, and follow that through. You know, from the actual resin to make a plastic bottle, all the way through its end product when that bottle is filled with water and the cap is on, right, and the label is on. How much does that cost at the end of the day? Understanding your true total cost, you know, from end to end. But, you know, in 2019, early 2019, it was late 2018, you started really hearing a terminology called digitizing of your supply chain. Well, we all, in all industries, have different buzzwords, right? I always try to KISS and say, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Okay, let's go digitize our supply chain. Ooh, we'll put it on a fancy screen and there you go. Well, no. What does that mean? Well, cash is king to the CFO, but in our world, data becomes king. So data is actually driving a lot of business decisions in the supply chain world, all the way through from end to end to satisfy what that customer needs at the end of the day. You can go actually to give a plug for Supply Chain Now Radio. You can go to actually podcast number 135 if you want to learn a little bit more about digitizing your supply chain. Myself and a very formidable individual who's very astute in that area, we're honored enough. Jamie Forrest. We are honored enough to be on Supply Chain Now Radio and address that specific issue. Also, what we're seeing as well, believe it or not, is coming down to labeling. Because we're so litigious in our world. Has anybody ever looked at a ladder? You ever gone to Home Depot to buy a ladder? Like if you look up both sides of the ladder, it's covered just with warning labels and everything else from a liability standpoint, right? Well, that's happening across the board in pretty much everything that we do, and that's cost. And what we're seeing now is actually technology come to play, and e-labeling is what they're calling it. And again, as you design new products, think about that packaging, think about that labeling. How's that all impact? Where's that cost come from? How can we make it better? You know, a simple example was the QR codes, right? Now you can actually scan, you know, an e-label, and it'll give you that chain of custody. I made a mistake and I said chain of command earlier when Greg was talking about blockchain. It's actually chain of custody. So you're going to be able to see that on a lot of your goods in regards to pharmaceuticals and things of that nature. So you'll know what's happening. And believe it or not, it's very heavy in a market that a lot of us don't like to talk about, which is actually the legalization of marijuana products, right? But it's a reality that's happened from state to state. We actually have technology in place today and ERP systems and digitized supply chain that actually tracks that particular plant from seed all the way to harvest. And that chain of custody is visible to you, the end customer, so you know who did what, when, where, and why, and how.
Well, and I happen to be on the board of one of those ERPs in the cannabis industry, and it has an incredible amount of information. What fertilizers were used, how much sunlight it got, whether it was real or manufactured sunlight, you know, things like that are captured, and literally every piece of the product is tracked and traced because governments require it. And actually, it's a very good model for traditional supply chain, and I can see that expanding into traditional supply chain.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Tom.
Yeah. So just, you know, when you think of the supply chain of the future, it is definitely technology based. It's definitely, by definition, digitizing your supply chain and creating that data, using the data that you have inherent today and turning that into electronic format that can be normalized and regurgitated back into intelligible dashboards, all different department heads and all different levels. And we're seeing that happen today, and it's making companies more efficient. It's making them more cost effective. And at the end of the day, those are going to be the winners of the race, because those who are not doing it, as you'll see here in one of our concluding slides, they're going to be on the side of the road, or they're not even going to be around.
Yeah.
So with that, Greg, if we could move to takeaways.
Should be coming up shortly here. Well,
Yeah,
the big takeaway, I bet you don't even need a slide for this. The customer is the beginning and the end of the supply chain, and the customer is in command of the supply chain and commerce in ways like we never have been before. People are trying to detect what we're going to do next in order to fulfill our needs and wishes. So that's a big point. I think we've hit a lot of these points. I think the final point is really the most important, and that is you have to adapt, right? It is to the point, and we'll see this. We have seen it already, but we will see this continue coming out of this crisis, that you will either adapt or you'll die. And in order to adapt, you have to do some of the stuff that Tom was talking about: plan, create alerts, get technological, adjust, change, improve, both human processes and technological processes, and even manual processes if you must have them. That's really the biggest part of it. I feel like we gave you a lot of those takeaways throughout, didn't we? But we have a slide here, so if you go back to the presentation, you can see at least what we thought some of the most important ones were. So let's talk about it. Steve, I think we're ready. If there are any additional questions, if everyone hasn't either fallen asleep or gone to dinner.
Yep, we actually do have a couple more.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk.
All right, let's go. Fire away, Steve.
So Michael Sullivan asks if there is a recommended supply chain software, or are most of them the same?
Wow. So that's a lot. They are not the same. And a lot of it depends on the segment of supply chain and the goal of the problem that you're solving, or the challenge that you're solving. Because there are literally tens of thousands of supply chain softwares out there. Some of them focus on transportation. Some of them focus, as we just talked about, on forecasting and planning and optimization. Some of them focus on warehouse management. Some of them focus on store management. There are all types of solutions out there. I can tell you that there are people who can tell you, if you've got a problem, what are the top solutions to look at. And I would suggest you look at Gartner, which is a technology analyst group with an incredibly talented supply chain practice. There's another company called Forrester that does a similar thing. And Laura Cesari, Supply Chain Insights. You can get a lot of information, but what you've got to feed them is, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, and here's the goal that I'm trying to reach. And then you'll be able to tell what that supply chain technology application is.
Yeah, I'll simplify that for you, Greg, in a nutshell. So contact me offline, and I'll be happy to have a little bit more deeper dive with you and understand what your true need base is and what you're trying to accomplish. Because believe it or not, there are, to Greg's point, plenty of solutions out there, and it's not just the big boys anymore. I mean, typically, it was the Oracle and SAPs, and nothing against those guys. They do a great job and great work. But at the end of the day, was that really affordable for the small, mid-size customer? The answer was no. There are plenty of technologies that are out there today that are very affordable to get you to that point. So please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to. And if we don't have the answer for you, we probably know somebody that does, and we can refer you to them as well. Greg cited
if you
some
think
great
about,
sources too.
I just jumped back to this. What is a supply chain diagram? There are at least 100 different companies supplying every aspect of every segment of the supply chain we described, and even subsegments within that. So there is a lot to learn there for sure. Find an expert. Oh,
All right.
Thanks for the question.
Yep. Next, Jesus asks, given that this pandemic highlighted a demand issue, what kind of actions or initiatives can be undertaken to help shape demand?
Well, we should never, ever cease commerce all at once, all across the world. That's the number one thing I hope that we learned from this. We should warn people and create a time for change. Now, of course, we were sort of at the mercy of the accuracy of the representation of the problem from the source country. So we were a little bit behind the 8 ball to begin with. But demand is being shaped every single day. Every time you go and look at a kayak online and that kayak ad follows you for the rest of your life, that is demand shaping, and it is occurring and has been occurring, as you are probably well aware from that example, for nigh on a decade now. We have to get to the consumer, and we have to understand what influences the consumer in order to do that. Once the lid has come off and a crisis occurs, that's when things are really difficult to predict. For instance, we're going into hurricane season. We know what's going to happen in hurricane season, and retailers and the government have provisioned for that with extra stocks of plywood and 10 penny nails and whatever else, 16 penny nails probably. 10 penny nails won't hold. And various and sundry things like that are already done. What we need to do is be more accurate in preempting and predicting demand, and then responding when we are inevitably wrong, because even at its best, any forecast methodology is going to have some semblance of error.
Yeah, so if I may add to that just real quick, the Amazon effect was in full bore prior to COVID-19, right? And what has driven the Amazon effect? It's been the consumer. Mm-hmm. So what you have seen is a paradigm shift from B2B business to B2C, and Greg had stated a stat earlier with regards to the baby boomers. What is it, 10,000
a day?
10,000 a day are retiring, right? Well, those seats are being filled, right, by the next up and coming generations, and
right.
The millennials have taken a beating, right? But at the end of the day, if your company is not into social media, they need to be, because social media, look what it does in the geopolitical environment, right? Social media is actually a demand creator, and technology as well. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to look for something, and I'll go outside of Amazon, right? And all of a sudden I find that particular product or something I'm looking at, a little box will pop up through AI and bots, right? And it pops up and it says, oh, Amazon happens to have this, and here's the price. So as a consumer, I'm looking to make a conscious decision. Is it the least expensive, or do I go to reviews? All these things are impacting demand creation. And how does that affect you as engineers? Well, again, I think that comes back to the holistic view and the communication with, internally within your organizations, to really understand how that flows from end to end. And in the end, being the beginning, is the consumer, and understanding regardless of your industry, what it is that you guys are making are you making the right product for the right person at the right time? And what else? The other thing that's driving demand, believe it or not, is being customizable, right? Nike's a great example, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can go on there and you can actually go onto their website and you can actually create your own Nike shoe and have it fully 100% customized, produced and delivered to you. And there's technology that's coming to make a lot of that happening. If we jump forward into the machine industry, right, hard goods, you're seeing 3D printing come to light. So spare parts and having spare parts of inventory are eventually going to be pretty much obsolete, because guess what? If you've got a 1952 Ford whatever, and that bolt or engine bolt or something is missing, guess what? You can probably contact somebody and they'll actually produce that in the 3D, because a lot of the alloys now are becoming more, it just continues to expand the amount of raw materials that 3D printing can generate, and they can create that custom part for you, that one-off. And if you have the ability to do that, you're going to get the business.
Okay, and next, Adolfo says, in the nuclear field, one problem is fake replacement parts being provided mostly from China. Now, I can tell you that's not just the nuclear field. We suffer from that in the electronics industry a lot as well. So.
Yeah. Yeah, blockchain is the solution there. Provenance is the key word. Actually, the most counterfeited product on the planet is olive oil. And blockchain making sure that we understand the source and can verify the source and can verify each handoff throughout the supply chain will be a solution that will solve that problem. Wow, that was a short answer.
Yeah.
These guys they're dying.
Yeah, there was a couple back and forth, so I had to get down to the next
no, that's
legit
okay.
question there.
These guys aren't used to a short answer, so.
Okay, so the next one is from Tom. On your TP comment, not only has production focused on less selection, but roles are now 10% narrower for some brands, i.e. Charmin.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I have not noticed that.
So
that allowed them to get one more. That allowed them to get probably one or two more rolls out of the big roll. Is why they've done that. They may or may not. My bet is on not go back to the original size. These things tend to be sort of seismic shifts in production. We talked about today. We talked about fuel surcharges in freight, which were instituted back when diesel fuel was $4.40 a gallon, and now diesel fuel is $2 or less, and yet a lot of carriers still charge fuel surcharges.
Right.
So we may see some of these changes stick, but that's a really good point. I had not noticed that. I think I'll go take a look.
Yeah, and actually, he had go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to add, so it's interesting you bring that up, and great point. But if you think about that, is that due to lean? Is it because somebody identified some waste and that they could get a better utilization out of whatever amount of product, raw material that they were actually getting? The carpet guys, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the state of Georgia here, up in Dalton and Calhoun area, about 70+% of all flooring materials come out of Dalton and Calhoun, Georgia. It is distributed throughout the United States and North America, and even actually exported. So you talk about the ability to comprehend utilization. How wide does a roll of carpet need to be, right? Or flooring. So they've become real experts at that to try to eliminate as much waste as possible in the production, as well as in to the consumer side of the equation. So great point on the Charmin tissue. Appreciate it. I'm
Yeah.
still going to try that velvet, I think.
Yeah, and Tom actually had a kind of a follow-up as well. He says, I thought I bought a defective package at Walmart, but the labeling was correct. Less square footage, but the same number of sheets. So there you go.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay,
That's
so
interesting.
so my follow-up to that, Tom, going back to what I spoke about earlier, just looking at things a little bit differently and walking through Sam's Club with the power bars, right, and the beef jerky being on the shelves, and there's no toilet paper to be found anywhere, right? So what did Tom Valentine do? Well, I went online and I bought Tux.
The sale, by the way, also there is, and this is something that is kind of a deeper supply chain concept: replacement or substitute product. The sale of bidets went up by an order of magnitude when toilet paper ran out. So,
but I had that Tux order in 2 days, delivered to my house with no problem, and there was nobody at my doorstep trying to steal it. Yeah. More compact, 100 container. There's my plug for Tux. So
there you go.
Yep.
And kind of send me a case.
One last follow up on the same topic. It's a TP night, I guess.
It's a TP life, man. Let me tell you.
Yeah, Roger says
supply chain. There couldn't be a better example, though. Frankly.
That's
Go
right.
ahead, Steve.
Roger says, have you noticed that colored TP disappeared years ago?
I didn't know that there ever was any. I know there was colored sunscreen at one point, so you could tell you had smeared enough on your kid. But
that's right. I remember that. That didn't last long, did it?
I can't imagine. No, it's a shame too. I can't imagine wanting colored toilet paper. But
all right, gentlemen. Well, we have lots of thank yous and great presentation comments and that sort of thing. But that's the end of our questions.
Outstanding. I don't know that there's much more to wrap up on other than I did just throw up the final slide. So if you want to reach out to us, LinkedIn is the place. You can follow or connect with us, of course. And if you have questions, fire them at us through LinkedIn or email, which we've got here. I'm happy to communicate with anybody. And if you're interested in learning more about supply chain, listen to Supply Chain Now. We literally do broadcast every single day, either a live stream or a podcast or sometimes a vlog episode. And if you follow Supply Chain Now, we'll let you know when something comes out.
And I just want to take the opportunity to thank each and every one of you that are still hanging with us.
Yeah, man.
An hour
Endured this. Thank you very much.
Minutes. But so my company is a little unique in this space, right? So feel free to reach out. We're truly here to help. And believe it or not, we're not so much a consulting company as we are representing a multitude, almost 20 now, best-in-class solution providers that address a lot of the challenges that we were talking about and discussing here today, even some of the questions that came up. So we're here to help. Please reach out to me directly. That's what we love to do. It's what we do every day. Again, connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you see some connections there that could provide benefit to you, be happy to make an introduction from that standpoint. But Greg and Scott Luton do a phenomenal job on Supply Chain Now Radio. And I just want to say thank you again, humbled for being asked to participate tonight. And thank you for your time and patience here this evening. And hopefully we've given you a little bit more insight into the supply chain.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thank you both. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I'm happy we got through some of the minor little technical difficulties in the beginning.
I didn't even remember that.
Yeah, it was so long ago.
Yeah, right.
But I think people learned lots. So thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
Yeah, and thanks to you, Steve, and the rest of your organization.
Steve.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Take care, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night,
It is
everybody.
indeed a good night.
Yep. We hope you enjoyed this presentation given at one of the Atlanta Metro meetings of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, an affiliate of the National Society of Professional Engineers. To find out more about us or or to join us. Check us out at gspe.org.